Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me for a new year of Global Insight is our resident International Affairs Specialist, Professor Robert Patman. Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
Donald Trump has exited, stage left, and Joe Biden has been inaugurated as the 46th President of the United States. The US, though, is now perhaps the most divided it has been since its civil war 160 years ago. Do Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, do they have what it takes to heal this divide? Or are their own views and agendas, are they going to just entrench divisions in that country?
Well, we're soon going to find out the answer to your question, and it's difficult to predict in advance. But one thing we're absolutely clear on is that they are indeed, Biden, Harris, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are presiding over the most difficult, in fact, the worst political and constitutional crisis since the Civil War of the 1860s, as you indicated in your introductory remarks. Biden has a number of advantages. He's enormously experienced, 47 years in Washington. Kamala Harris, I think, was a shrewd choice because it shows the administration's commitment to diversity, which was something that was a big criticism of the previous administration. I think the administration has to hit the ground running. We know that later today, Joe Biden will be signing 17 executive orders, many of which will be rescinding some of the things that the previous administration did. But it's got a very ambitious program, which I think is largely centered on Covid-19. I think the Biden administration's ability to convince Americans that they're getting on top of what is the number one problem, which is the runaway and rampaging impact of Covid-19, more than 400,000 Americans dead. And Biden, in his early public pronouncements as president, has taken time to honour the memory of those people who died. So I think if he can convince Americans in the first 3 months that, unlike the previous administration, he's focused on an issue which affects all Americans, irrespective of their gender, ethnicity, then I think that may be a big plus in him beginning to get more unity in the country.
Trump's presidency was about alternative facts, and that carried on right to the end, with him still saying that the election had been stolen from him, and that despite senior Republicans like the former Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, saying Biden had won and had won fairly. Will all of this suddenly get better under Biden? And how significant a threat to democracy is this phenomenon of alternative facts?
Well, I don't think the situation in the United States is going to rapidly, overnight, improve. I think it's going to be a hard slog for the Biden-Harris team. I think there are very real problems in the near future. I think the people who were motivated to storm the Capitol, many of whom are actually now being arrested, but there are plenty more like that. And one thing that we have to take into account, Bruce, is that according to a very reputable poll in the United States, 45% of Republican voters thought the storming of the Capitol was a justified act because of a stolen election. So these narratives run very deep, and it's going to be a big struggle to overcome this. I think that Biden's emphasis on unity is important in his inauguration speech, but let's unpack that a little bit. Unity, I think, as I understand it, from Biden's perspective, does not mean accepting the Republicans' agenda or compromising with it. I think Biden is very conscious, as Vice President of the Obama administration, that they missed an opportunity in the first 2 years because they reached out across the aisle and they didn't get gratitude from the Republicans by trying to come up with compromise solutions. So I think what's going to happen is that when Mr. Biden talks about unity, I think he means that the Republicans have to accept the rules of the political game, which is democracy. And let's be quite clear, a sizable number of Republicans supported, I'm talking about people elected office, more than 170 in the House of Representatives, and around about 38 to 40 accepted Mr. Trump's false narrative that the election was stolen. Now, for our viewers, when I say false narrative, I'm making that analysis on the basis of evidence. There were more than 60 lawsuits pursued by the Trump campaign. They were virtually all thrown out, except one which discovered that 2 dead people had voted for Mr. Trump, which was a bit of a hollow victory. So these repeated allegations by Mr. Trump, there's been absolutely no evidence to support them. Coming back to the unity thing, I think what Mr. Biden will say is that when Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley, Republican senators, get up and start questioning his budget, he'll say, you're in no position to question the budget because you haven't accepted the rules of democracy, which is, if you compete in a democratic election, and providing there is no legal evidence to the contrary, you have to peacefully accept the outcome. And that is something that Mr. Trump was unwilling to do. To this day, he has not conceded he lost the election, which is a fantasy. So the Republicans face a big challenge. We're talking about the challenges facing Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. But the Republicans, as a party, face a huge challenge. Now, my sense is we're going to see an evolution in the next 3 months. I think with Mr. Trump out of the picture and facing a lot of lawsuits in the near future, I think that some of the Republicans are going to have to revisit their position on the case that the election was stolen. Because they're not only going to come under fire from the media in general, but they're going to come under fire from their own supporters, particularly since Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, has joined the pragmatic camp. He was a close ally of Trump, but he parted company on the idea the election was stolen. So it's going to be very interesting. So I think to sum up, I think that Biden's emphasis on unity is important, but it doesn't mean unity at all costs. It doesn't mean you allow people who do not actually accept the democratic outcome to have a say in policy making, and I think they'll be very firm on that.
Right. As you said, Covid-19 has killed more than 400,000 Americans, and the weekly death toll is yet to peak. Once again, the problem seems to be a mistrust of established institutions and of traditional ways of knowing what is true, such as a trust in science. Are suspicions already too ingrained for too many Americans, or could this tragedy end up proving to doubters the validity and the worth of evidence-based decisions?
Well, it was interesting, in response to your question, Bruce, it was interesting in the inauguration speech that Mr. Biden said under his leadership, science and truth will be taken extremely seriously. And I think this was an important message to get out, because unfortunately one of the sad developments of the last 4 years, is the president has lied on everything from tax cuts paying for themselves, when in fact they added massively to the US federal deficit, to claims that Covid-19 was not serious and it was a flu that would probably disappear in April of 2019. To answer your question directly, I think presidential leadership is important. I think the message that comes out of the White House on issues like Covid-19 and the importance of science does actually throw an important shadow. One of the problems for Mr. Biden is he's inheriting a situation where his predecessor was anything but straight on a range of issues. And that will not be overdone overnight. But I think that it's a good start to say, on an issue like COVID-19, which doesn't recognise rhetoric, doesn't recognise boundaries, that we're going to make our decision in relation to COVID-19 on the basis of science and objective reality. Biden is making it quite clear in the first 100 days that mask wearing, there will be I don't know what measures he'll be putting precisely in place, but mask wearing will be deeply encouraged. And he's also intending to vaccinate 100 million people in the first 100 days. So again, this will, I think, if that is achieved, that may well turn the tide. But there are some long-term problems which transcend Trump and Biden with respect to what you described as alternative facts. And that is that many people, and this is a trend that I don't think is going to be any change in the immediate future, but in the last 15 years, we've seen a revolution with the provision of news through social media. And many people are choosing to get their own news through Facebook and other sites. And some of this news is basically quite unreliable in terms of its accuracy. And so some people are getting quite an inaccurate picture of the actual reality. It was striking to me that journalists who interviewed people who stormed the Capitol, US Capitol, on the 6th of January said that many of those people never even consulted Fox News, which was partisan towards the Trump administration. They simply got all their news from conspiratorial websites and also sites like Facebook and things like that. So in a sense then, how do you close that gap? How do you improve people's access to knowledge about issues which affect their well-being? That's a big challenge. But I think there are short and long-term possibilities for making progress there.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Te pono me te araha.